and this will be made available via QWF's YouTube channel. I will ask to please keep yourself muted unless you have, you would like to mention something, you have a comment at the very end. And on that note, we do ask to please hold any questions until the very end of this session. There will be a specific Q&A session that will be facilitated at the very end. But feel free to post your questions in the chat if you do get them, just giving the note that we might not be able to answer them until the end of the session. So I am very, very proud to introduce our guest speaker today, Katia Grubisic. So Katia is a writer, editor, and translator whose work has appeared in various Canadian and international publications. Her collection, What If Red Ran Out, was shortlisted for the A.M. Klein Prize for Poetry and won the Gerald Lampert Award for Best First Book. Her book translations include Martin Delvau's Whiteout, Stéphane Martelly's Little Girl Gazelle, and Marie-Claire Blais' Final Novels. Her translations of David Clareson's first novel, Brothers, and Of a Cemetery for Bees by Alina Dumitrescu were shortlisted for Governor General's Awards, and her translation of Clareson's short story collection, To See Out the Night, won the QWF Skoll Foundation Prize for Translation last year. Thank you very much. Passing it on out to Katia.
Thank you so much, Riley. Thank you, John, also for all your work behind the scenes. And thank you to Lori, who's in this square somewhere, for inviting me today. And thanks to all of you also for being here. I'm seeing around the virtual room also translators that are far more chevronated, if I may, than I. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation that will emanate from both having the really fresh perspectives of people with perhaps more curiosity than experience. And I'd like to invite my colleagues also to weigh in when we're having the Q&A, if anybody has anything to add, because it's quite, I think it's quite rare to have this kind of gathering. So as Riley mentioned, we're going to have a Q&A towards the end. It's not going to be short at all. There's so many people here that I want to give you lots of time to ask your questions if you want. So I think I'm going to leave about half an hour at least for questions. And then if, I have no problem not shutting up if there's time to fill at the end. But I do want to assure you there'll be lots of time for questions. Do use the little hand bonhomme to raise your hands when we get there for the questions. If for some reason you don't have access to that, just sort of wave frantically and I will see you, or John or Riley will mention something to me. You can also put comments or questions in the chat, though, as I say, there's a few kind of streams of management going on. So if we miss it, go back to gesticulation. So I want to ask also if everybody, I'm not sure how you can raise your hand. I mean, is there anyone who is not entirely comfortable with English? Is there anyone for whom I could repeat things in French? I know that we have some people who, je devrais le dire en français, des gens ici qui pourraient vouloir penser à traduire ou faire traduire leur propre livre. Et donc, si vous avez des questions en français, vous pouvez les poser également. I can translate them into English. But if there's anyone who's not 100% comfortable in English and would like me to repeat anything, please sort of raise your hand now or forever hold your peace. I would also, I'm going to begin actually by a quick sheet of acronyms that I'm going to refer to. So today's going to be a bit of shop talk, a little bit of kind of more abstract considerations of translation. I'm happy to entertain the questions about both, but I get the sense that the curiosity today is kind of twofold. So there are some people who are here who are really looking to learn how they can get their books translated. They're here as writers, whether in French or English or into or out of any other language, and who are looking for some resources and tips for how they can make that happen. So I'll speak to that a little bit first, and then I'll speak more to the translator side of things afterwards. So for people who are either I have a pet project or would like to just get started in literary translation, what are some avenues that are possible for that? And in both of those, there's a lot of overlap, of course, as you can imagine, but I do want to just give you a sense of a couple of acronyms that I'll be using a fair bit, just so you know what they are. And so give me 2 seconds. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So sorry. So these are the acronyms that I've got that I'll be referring to a fair bit throughout the conversation. So ALTA is the American Literary Translators Association. The Canada Council for the Arts, I think, is probably familiar to most people, as is likely the CALC, the Conseil des Arts et des Lettres du Québec. The CAM, many of you probably know, the Conseil des Arts de Montréal, and LTAC, or the ATTLC, is the Literary Translators Association of Canada. All the websites are obviously listed here as well on the right. The QWF, I don't know, some group of people who hang out together sometimes and who do good things. TWAC, many of you probably know, the Writers Union of Canada, and l'UNEC is Union des écrivains et des écrivains québécois.
Headphones don't work with Zoom.
Is there's an issue with sound somewhere?
In fact, someone was just not muted, Katia. Don't worry.
If anyone does have issues, just feel free to pop into the chat, and John or Riley will sweep to the rescue. So I'll make that available again toward the end if you want the websites. They're all easily Googleable, and I'll be referring to some of those. Hopefully, if you miss an acronym, just let me know and we can come back to those. But those are some of the more obvious players in the literary translation ecosystem in Canada. So I want to begin actually by showing you a clip of another translator who's far more chevronné than I am, who has some things to say that I think actually preface the conversation in an interesting way. So give me 2 seconds. So much of Zoom still is taken up by just like scrolling through and trying to find things that we've lost. For example, this, which I can't find now. Sorry, give me a minute here. Talk amongst yourselves. Okay, so now I can't find anything that I've opened. All right, never mind. What I was going to show you was actually a clip by Daniel Hahn. Oh, here we go. All right. So give me 2 seconds to set this up, and then I will be all yours.
Well, I didn't realize everyone was putting their faces on, so I had to put my face on.
We like seeing your faces. So here's a translator that many of us know and many of us respect. He has a few words that actually I think are really pertinent to how we think and how I think about translation. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
I did them. I think of it as being slightly like, a collaborative novel in which someone else did the first dozen drafts and then passed it on to me, and I did the next slot, did the next handful of drafts. And there's a significant shift between draft 12 and 13 because all of the words change into a different language. But it feels like it is a kind of evolving of a single piece of a single work of art, a single piece of work that two people have collaborated on. And so I think this sense that one of the things I love about the International Vicar is that the translator and the writer are both credited equally. It's not, this is a prize for the writer, and we sort of apologetically say it's a bit translated, but you wouldn't even notice. Or conversely, a prize for a translator, and we kind of somehow fetishize the specialness of translation, which I think is also not terribly helpful to anyone. But the idea that it's a collaboration, an odd collaboration, and often a collaboration that happens in series rather than in parallel. But I think that's the right way to think about it.
So I really like what he talks about in terms of acknowledgement, but also in terms of collaboration. And that's something I'm going to be coming back to over and over again throughout this talk. So I want to keep that in mind. That relationship that goes in both directions, and that's very much a continuum, not just between the translator and the writer, as Dan mentions, but also between all the secondary players, the people we think of as being secondary, the publishers and the people who organize the festivals and the book fairs and the editors and the promoters, in some cases the embassies or consulates. There's a really wide range of collaborative possibility, and both in terms of making the translation happen as a writer, if you have a book that you'd like to get translated, and in terms of as a translator to get books that you have translated or would like to out there. I think that ecosystem and all of its crucial players are really important to keep in mind. So I'm going to begin by talking about how to get your book translated. So I think many of you that I see here have written books. Some of them, I think, just from seeing the names on the screen, have had the luck to have them translated. And often you can weigh in on this afterwards if you'd like, but the process happens when a translator happens to read your book, because translators are first and foremost readers as well as often writers. They love it and they say, I really want to be able to read this in my own, to think this in my other language. And so that's often how it happens, a kind of happenstance or serendipity. And that's great when it does happen, and that's the luck of the draw in some cases. But I want to make sure I address also what happens when you feel like your book should be translated and you haven't had that sort of that strike of the coup de foudre that has linked you with a translator that you can work with. So the first thing I would highlight is the importance of knowing why you want this particular book translated. I mean, we have, as writers, we have insights into our own books that we think everybody else should be obvious to everybody else. And I don't think we sometimes take the time to really frame that quality or topic or content in a way that considers the marketing considerations, the readership considerations, the international considerations in some sense. I think that if you're able to think of your book from an editor's point of view, from a publisher's point of view, and from the point of view of any number of possible readers, you'll be that much more successful at pitching it to a translator, to a publisher, and to a market, to a readership. And I kind of hate the word market, but we can think of it as just more readers that read differently than the people we have access to just in our first language or in the language the book is written. And so before you start even looking for a translator or looking for a publisher, I would encourage you to start really framing your book as you would, not just because it's a thing that you've written and it's it belongs, it's a part, it's like an extra organ that you've somehow taken out of your body and brought out into the real world, but really be a bit pragmatic about it. Is it a book that fits into a particular trend? Have you written a book, for example, about the climate crisis? Have you written a book that's timely or pertinent in some way? Have you written a book that seems to belong to some kind of current pattern in writing? Are there a lot of books? I'm reading a lot of children's books, for example, right now, about about diversity but anthropomorphized animals, sort of like the bluebird and the sea of red birds and how they get along. Are there other titles that you've read that seem to speak to the same thing that your book is speaking to? And so really looking at your book in context, not just as something which you have created out of your deepest part of your soul, but also as something that could be shared, including in a commercial platform. And we'll get to this a little bit later, but how you think about it and also how you write about it, if you have a chapter summary or a description or even an author bio, those documents will be really, really useful in terms of presenting yourself beyond that face-to-face meeting, but presenting yourself to a publisher or to a translator. Your relationship with your publisher is also going to be probably the most significant point of contact and point of entry into translation. So ideally, your publisher has scads of resources and has an entire marketing team devoted to making sure that they sell the translation rights, and they go to all the translation fairs and the festivals, and they're putting free copies of your book into all the right hands. But any of us who have published books know that that's not always the case, unfortunately. However, your publisher does have that skill set, even if they don't always have the resources. And so if they're made aware that you are looking to get your book translated, and if they don't have the resources, that you're willing to do some of the legwork yourself, even just sometimes making your publisher do the work that they are equipped and positioned to do, is a huge part of the equation. Because they might, your book came out, they have 8 other books, they have next season to plan for, they're already proofreading 2 years ahead, and so your book may be not overlooked, but they might have already moved on to other things. And so just one of the better things you can do is make them kind of earn their keep, right? They're the ones who are going to have contact with other publishers. They're the ones who are going to be able to gain entry into library conferences and translation rights book fairs, international fairs, all of those events where a writer can really easily get lost in the soup, but a translator's the representative or the publisher's representative will be there as as an industry event, not just a creative event. And so they're really your best ambassador for making sure your book gets into the right hands. So the first thing I would say is get on your publisher's ass, basically. I want to open also a little sidebar to talk about self-publishing and some of the challenges involved there, because not everyone obviously has access to a publisher. In my experience, I've translated works that have been self-published, and I've also been on bodies that have vetted self-published works for membership in various organizations, and it adds an extra barrier essentially to whatever you're, to either publishing or to publishing a translation. If you have self-published, there are tools that you can use to find a translator and to still have your book translated. You will have that much more of a hurdle in terms of getting your translator paid and in terms of getting that translation published. Though it can be true that if you've written a book that is in a language that let's say the target language speaks to the theme better, then by all means, try to find a language, try to find a translator into that language, and then sell that translation as the published, as the book. If anyone has any questions specifically about self-publishing, we can talk more about kind of instances and examples, because there are a couple of programs that might help that process. But I want to mention it now in case you want to put that on the back burner for the Q&A period, or if that's of specific interest to anyone. I want to also talk about how to choose a translator. If you don't have the luck of having someone come up and say, I loved your book, I want to translate it, where do you find someone who is competent, who has the skills, who has the knowledge, and who's a good fit? So there's a couple of places. One of the organizations I mentioned is the LTAC, the Literary Translators Association of Canada, which has a directory on their website. And so you can go by the directory and sort through and see who some of the translators are. There are some of the names you might have seen before. They will list their bio, including in many cases genres. It'll say, so-and-so has translated plays and works for young adults or whatever. And so if that's your genre, then by all means, maybe that would be a good fit. The best way to choose a good translator is to read their work, however. And I would argue that that's also the best way to choose a publisher. I see that Riley has just put up the ATTLC LTAC website in the chat as well, if anybody wants to take a note of that. Thank you. The point of contact with what they've done is going to be way more pertinent than any bio you read on any website. And that's true whether you go to the American website, to ALTA, to LTAC. There's also a Facebook group that I can share afterwards, which is a really good repertoire. It doesn't have a directory, but it's a really good gathering of international translators. And so, I've gone there to find help, for example, with really specific dialects of Arabic that I needed help with for a book. Or if you're looking for someone to translate your book in or out of a specific language, that can be a really good place to try to join and post and say, I have this book, here's my pitch, here's the description, here's what it's pertinent for, I know what I'm selling, I know what what I've got, and I'm looking for someone to translate this into whatever. So there's a number of points of contact you can make. But I would really suggest that before you approach anybody specifically, read their work and know exactly what it is that you want to connect with, right? The same thing with a publisher. You're not going to send, a graphic novel to a publisher who only does academic textbooks. And the same thing is true of finding a good match, finding a good collaboration with someone to work with, right? You want them to be a continuum of your voice, of your characters, of your story, of your structure. And if they're the wrong fit, that won't always be the best way to be efficient about getting your book out in the world. I wanted to also talk about or mention the question of identity of translator and writer. There was a case, when Amanda Gorman, Biden's poet laureate, had her book being published, there was a bit of a scandal because one of the translators chosen wasn't Black. And I've had many of us have had this conversation I see around the virtual table here for years now about whether that correspondence is necessary. And I don't think any of us have found the answer, or that there is an easy answer to this, but I remember when Stéphane Martelly approached me to translate her book, L'Enfant Gazelle, Little Girl Gazelle, and I said to her, and this was also in the middle of Black Lives Matter, and I said to her, would you feel more at home with a Black translator? And she says, no, I'm Black enough for both of us. And not every writer will have that reaction. Not every queer writer needs a queer translator. Not every woman needs but I think that there's something to be said for having references that fit. To give you another kind of silly example, I was interviewing David Hamel at one point, who had translated a book by Martine Delvaux. And there was this conversation about how he had translated this elaborate scene about the female orgasm. There are obviously resources we have as translators to find ways into an identity or an experience that we have not had. But there's something to be said for at least openness to that experience, and for an awareness that that you may be taking the space also of someone who hasn't had access to that space. So I do want to caution both writers and translators that sometimes the best fit is also, sometimes the best fit is an obvious one, sometimes it's not. But to make sure that you're not going to the just going to the biggest name or to the obvious choice without leaving room for perhaps voices that haven't had as much space. We can talk about this more in the Q&A also, but I did want to mention that because I think it's been a topic of conversation for the past couple of years. So I want to talk about translation versus publication. So do you find a publisher first or do you find a translator first? So as those of you around the table who've translated work know, this is the Canadian situation. Around the world, different translation ecosystems work in different ways, but in Canada, the money happens with the publishers, right? So a publisher will buy the rights to a book, the translation rights or the world rights or the English rights or whatever, however they're being sold, and then they will have the funding. They will apply for funding from the Canada Council and get funding from the Canada Council to pay the translator directly. And so the onus is very much on the publisher to do that work. That said, by all means, if you're a writer, absolutely pitch your book, absolutely have your publisher pitch your book, actually put yourself out there and make sure that you're speaking to the right people. But the way that let's say contractually, the way that the money happens is that the acquiring publisher applies for money from the Canada Council to pay the translator and to pay for accessory fees for the publication. So that obviously complicates things. If you have a published book that's done really well and that's won a bunch of awards, that'll be an easier sell for you and for your publisher to approach. Let's say you're having your book originally in French, published in English, to approach an English language translator and publisher and say, this book, won everything, and here are the rights, and here would you like to apply for some funding and make it happen. The target language publisher is still taking a risk. They're still going to be publishing a book that may or may not, be profitable, but the buck kind of stops with them. So it's both an advantage because we have this really great funding system through the Canada Council that's existed for a number of years, but it also means that there's a bit less freedom in terms of how you want to how you'll be able to publish your translation or your book. Do you find a publisher first? Do you find a translator first? Who's in charge of whom, basically? So I don't know if that makes sense. We can talk about that a little bit more because it's a particularity of the Canadian system that it does not hold true elsewhere in the world for good and for ill. But here there's very much the sense that you approach a publisher, they buy the rights. They will sometimes have their own in-house not in-house translator, and so no one's like sitting around on a couch being paid salaried for this, but they will have translators with whom they work. And so you may not always be able to choose your translator. So really, you can go either way. You can have someone interested in your book and they can pitch it for you, or you can approach a publisher to have it translated. But they will often have the last word just because of the way our funding system works in this country. So I don't know if that's clearish to those who haven't been through that particular gauntlet, but we can definitely clarify that or talk more about it at the end. I also want to mention, so approaching a publisher, first of all, as I said, with translators, make sure you read their work. Don't pitch a YA novel to someone who does academic text. Make sure you know what they're publishing. And how do you even find them, right? So you've gone to your library or to your bookstore, you've bought all their books, because it's a great fit, it's a perfect fit, but where do you even find them? If your publisher is doing their work and going to translation rights fairs, then so much the better for you. It's much easier for them to be doing that work. You can also, however, approach publishers at any number of other events. There are readings everywhere. They're back in person now. Everyone is delighted to have people come up and meet them afterwards, not just to show your book, but to make sure they know you and introduce yourself and make yourself familiar with them and their presence. No one wants you to kind of assault them and say, I've written this book and you're going to publish it because it's amazing. But definitely establishing those connections, those collaborations at events, at festivals, at any kind of networking events, at the QWF Awards, for example, if you're there. There's so many good instances to establish a relationship with publishers, which may or may not lead to your actual book being published by them, but who knows who they might know. And so it's an ecosystem that you want to be able to be comfortable in and network in as a participant, not just as someone with something to sell, very much as someone who is contributing to the community as well. So those events, i.e. readings, bookstore launches, and if you go to a bookstore launch, buy the books. If you're interested in a publisher, buy their books and make sure that they're there. They're seeing you. This is a really great book. I'm writing a book that's kind of similar. Would you be interested in seeing the manuscript? I'm getting it translated. I've had this translator. I don't have a translator, but maybe you do. So those are where those sparks can happen. And finally, I want to also mention something that people often forget about is journal publications. If you don't have a translator, a publisher can help you find one. But if you do have a translator and no publisher yet, there's lots of journals. In fact, most journals at this point will publish translations. Again, make sure you read the journal, find one that's a good fit for your topic, your theme, and your genre. There's almost endless possibilities for publishing poetry and fiction, especially, but even creative nonfiction. In journals in Canada and around the world. There's a few dedicated specifically to literary translation. I'm thinking mostly of Asymptote, which is this fantastic journal. I'm not sure if John or Riley, you can post that, or I can post it afterwards in the chat. But otherwise, even most mainstream journals will publish translation. Carte Blanche is an example. QWF's own Carte Blanche publishes translations. So that's a really good way to publish a snippet of something, and then you have something published when you're pitching a publisher, and you can say, here, this was published in Carte Blanche, this is published in Asymptote, this is published in in the Fiddlehead, and that becomes your calling card. It becomes a piece of credibility because it's actually been been vetted and been deemed publishable, and then you have something that you can approach publishers with. So that's a really good stepping stone, often for an initial kind of foray into finding a publisher. And then I want to mention some support programs. So there's the Canada Council program, the Canada Council that I mentioned, which gives money to publishers to pay the translators. So that's the most common way. There's also, however, the CALC has a program, the Conseil des Arts et des Lettres du Québec it's under their creative, here I'll put the link in the chat. Under their create, and where is this? Sorry, Conseil des Arts Montréal, creation. Here we go. I'll put this in the chat for you. They do have the possibility of translating, of a writer applying for their work to be translated. And so for that, you submit, I think it's like a chapter or so, and the CV of the translator you're proposing. I've had a couple of writers approach them with me as translator, and I've not seen any success in those applications. So and it's a fairly recent program, and I know that CALC has been just swamped by a demand since the pandemic, and I know that their acceptance rate has really dropped since then, and I know that there's perhaps more space for more resources from the provincial government as well. But that is an option if you have a project that you haven't found a publisher for, or if you're self-publishing, to kind of come back to that, where you can approach them with your translators. That's a good program. And sorry, I've just put it in here we go, meeting group chat, so you can have a look at that and see if that's perhaps pertinent. I also want to mention the Conseil des Arts de Montréal. If all of you live on the island, or if perhaps one of you or your translator live on the island, if you have a translator you want to work with, there is under the Littérature et Conte segment at the CAM, there is an option for working as a collective, so as an ad hoc kind of group under their project funding, and I'll put that in the chat as well. And that's a way for you to theoretically approach them with a project that involves 2 or more people. So it can be you and the translator, it can be even a writer and illustrator, that kind of thing. It's fairly flexible, and there's a way for some project funding. It's not, I don't think it would be enough money to publish a whole book, but it's some money to go towards that. If you want to perhaps do a few pieces for a journal, that would be a really good avenue. I want to also mention, for those of you who are writing, especially not in Indigenous languages in the territory of Canada, or the 2 colonial languages, French and English, there are often foreign embassies and consulates which will have programs. The Canada Council does have a program called Arts Abroad that I can also post here if I can find it. Here we go, Arts Abroad. And that money goes directly to foreign publishers, but often even beyond foreign publishers, you might be able to find foreign embassies that have some programs for promoting the interlinguistic exchanges and that kind of thing. Or I'm thinking, for example, of the Frankfurt Book Fair a couple of years ago, when Canada was the featured country there. There was this huge program support for translations into German of Canadian work. So that stuff pops up now and again. If you keep your ear to the ground and you kind of stay in the network, you may find that, okay, maybe this is the year that I get my whole corpus translated to German, or whatever. So keep those opportunities in mind, really stay attuned to what's going on in the market, so to speak, and you might find that that what you've created is a perfect fit for something. I also wanted to mention secondary support and the importance of editing, especially. I think there is a sense that when you've written a book, it's out there and it's perfect. It's on paper. It's like it's bound and there's no typos, and then it's magic, right? It exists in the world, and therefore it needs no further work. It cannot have any further work because it exists in the world. However, that sometimes translates into an assumption that a translation doesn't need to be edited because you're just translating a thing that's already done. As a writer, you want to make sure that your translator, if you have a publisher and a translator, that your translator, their product has to be edited. And so there's a segment of Canada Council funding that I'll address when I talk about the translator side of things, which gives specific money for substantive editing of the manuscript, of the translated manuscript. And I cannot stress enough the importance of making sure that there's an extra pair of eyes, not just a proofreader to catch, typos and whatever, but someone who speaks both the languages and someone who can actually bring a literary eye to bear on that book to make sure that it's as good as it can be. Do not settle, as a writer, do not settle for not having a book edited in translation, please. There is, you read it and even as a translator, sometimes, I work into English mostly, and sometimes I forget what English sounds like because I've just got both of them kind of dancing in my head. And you want an editor who's like, you're like, this is not English, you can't write that, right? You want someone who's just going to catch you out on those weird turns of phrase or on those mishaps and really have an eye out for the book. So please, as writers, insist on having the editing step built into that process. It's as important, if not more, than all the other, marketing hullabaloo that's going to happen afterwards. So I'm just going to go back and give you a little PowerPoint slide to review those points. And do we want to do questions about that now? We could probably do all the questions at the end. Can I have kind of nods of heads or shakes of heads? Not questions at the end is okay? All the questions at the end? Okay, let's do that. Thanks to those who nodded their heads. And I'm just going to share this. If anyone wants to jot this down, or if anyone wants these, I can send this to you afterwards, or this is kind of just a reminder to. There we go. So these are the main points I've talked about for writers. I'll let you read through those. So know your book and know your work. Put your publisher to work. The kind of bracket about self-publishing that we can talk about further later. How to choose a translator. How to approach the translator, the publisher, the funders, and so forth. Different options, so including journals, notably. Some of the support programs that we can talk about more if you have questions, including the Canada Council, and the highlighted importance of editing. So I'll just leave that up for 2 seconds in case anybody wants to let that sort of stir up questions for later. All right. Which brings us to talking more on the translator side. So I'm going to talk about this briefly, and then we can get to some Q&A. As a translator, the questions are kind of the same, but reversed. Again, I want to remind you of that continuum, that you're essentially going into a house that someone else has built, and you have the freedom to renovate it and the responsibility of honoring the way it's been put up. When you are approaching a book to translate, you often have a coup de cœur, right? You have this book that you land on and you love it, and somehow you hear it in the language you translate into. It's like it speaks to you in that language, and you know that you want to bring it into English or into French or into whatever your language is. That is wonderful. Those kind of pet projects are wonderful, and they're not always the ones that get published, unfortunately. So the question is twofold. There's a question of what you're translating and why, and what translations you're trying to publish and why. In either case, I want to begin by a rather discouraging statement. I had this prof when I was in dance school who would start every year with just saying, "You're all going to be poor, and this field sucks, and you shouldn't do it." So this is me honoring his spirit. There is, just because someone has hands doesn't mean that they're a concert pianist. And most of us in Montreal, I think, have access to multiple languages, which is why, one of the reasons I love this city. But it obviously doesn't make anyone a translator necessarily. I'm also not wedded to, translation programs or diplomas or certificates. I don't have a translation degree, for example. And so that's certainly not necessary, but there is a skill set that's necessary. So before you set out as a translator, part of it is you have to learn the craft, right? And you can learn that craft by translating. And so you can crack out a book that's been translated before and just practice and see what happens and see what you can learn by doing it. There's heaps of books, there's heaps of ways to learn, including, translation programs. There's lots of professional development opportunities that I'm going to mention, lots of ways to learn and to hone the craft. But don't be my neighbor. I had this neighbor when we lived in Milan who, when we were chatting and I met him, he said, "Oh, I'm a translator too." And I was like, "Oh, that's great." He charged 10 cents a word, and he had no background and no idea what he was doing. And he was also a DJ, and he was also a contractor, and he was also a drug dealer. So like, don't be that guy, basically. So hone your skills, know your skills. You don't have to have all this. I mean, none of us have all the skills, even after years of work, which is why we keep doing it. Like Pablo Casals, who was 90 and thought, "Oh, maybe I'll get good one day." But don't just assume that because you have access to multiple languages that you have also it's not just skill, but there has to be something writerly about the translator. The translator has to have that, not just the equivalency, but the art, essentially. So make sure that that's what you're working towards. So to get back to the kind of business side of things, after that cri de cœur for the coup de cœur, there's also the instances in which you might pitch a book that, again, as a writer, choosing a book that's maybe pertinent because it's timely or because it's part of a trend that they're seeing. You can also read those books and pitch those books. So as a translator, if you're looking for something, you'll have a book that you love. I have this book that I've been wanting to translate for like 12 years and nobody will take it, and I love it and I want to translate it one day and whatever. I also have this, a whole bunch of books that I read, I go buy books, I go to the library, I'm subscribing to all the catalogs, all the publishers' emails, all the newsletters to make sure I know what's out there. And sometimes something will twig, that seems like it might be a good fit for me and a good fit for the world. So yes, there's those moments where you're looking for someone to publish the book that you want to translate because you feel like it should be read. And also, as a translator who maybe wants to, pay the rent or whatever, you also have to be aware that there's some sense of the market, of the readerships, of the publishers, of what their needs are. And you can have both. Both are absolutely fine. You can love the books, and ideally don't translate anything you hate, but there's always going to be books that are really close to your heart and that might not make it out into the world. And that's maybe okay. I want to talk briefly about pitching, because I think that's an aspect. When we love a book, we don't often think about how the publisher needs to have it articulated. So again, in Canada, it's the publisher who applies for the funding from the Canada Council. And so when you're approaching them, you're wanting to say to them, take this risk on this book because it's awesome, because it's timely and pertinent. It has to be now. This author is amazing. And you might be able to sell it. And so when you're creating a pitch, you're essentially building their catalog for them. You want to have an author bio, a description of any prizes the author has won, of their trajectory, any places they have lived. So for example, if there's a publisher from, I don't know what, from Magog, and there's an author from Magog, maybe that's a really good fit, right? There's still a sense, just, virtuality notwithstanding, there is still a sense of regional pertinence and kind of investing in communities. And so find some link to the publisher if you can. As I say, any prizes, any similar experiences, if they've taught, if they've published other books, if they've, in other fields. Also have a really good description of the book. So longer than what you would find on the back cover. Usually you'd want to have at least 500, 700 words. Do all the spoilers, you're not trying to build, it's not like a Netflix summary, right? You're really trying to explain the book and touch on the major themes, touch on the characters, give it a good description of the plot, including what happens, including spoilers, including the ending, including also points of interest. So for example, if they touch on the climate crisis, how do they approach it? Is it a YA novel? What are the genres? What are the themes? So really have a description of the book that's as broad as possible and as comprehensive as possible. Even if it goes to a page, that's this pitch could be like, I would say 3 pages-ish even. And then have your own bio. And again, this is the tooting of the horn. So list your publications, list your any professional credibility you have, basically, whether that's prizes or translation work that you've done, or work that you've done in adjacent topics. So for example, if it's a book about the climate crisis, maybe you're a prof with a specialization in the climate crisis, which is what makes you the expert on this book. So why this book, why this author, and why you translating it, basically. If you haven't translated before, that's fine. If you have books that you've written, that's excellent. So you can say, you know, I found this book of poetry, I really want to translate it, and I've translated this in a journal, and I have, you know, I won this prize for my own book of poetry. So maybe you want to take me on, even though I don't have this translation experience. So definitely provide a really good overview of why you're a good person to translate this book, even if that means that you don't have that much translation experience to your on your CV. And then the other piece that I hate most of all, and that publishers really need, is comparative titles, right? So comp titles are how they're going to know that it's going to sell. And so if you're publishing a book, you want to know that, you know, is a comp title like A Room of One's Own? Is a comp title, you know, whatever, like is a comp title, you know, Harry Potter? What other books is your book like that they're going to know and that are going to be hopefully impressive, and they're going to be an indication that this might sell? Ideally, I mean, I've decided Virginia Woolf or, you know, Harry Potter, but ideally choose books that have been published in the past like 5 to 7 years, and so they have a sense of what the market reception of those books has been, and ideally provide 3 to 5 comp titles that speak to different aspects of the book. So if it's a YA novel, choose a YA novel. If it's a book that has the climate crisis as a topic, choose one that has that as a topic as well. So give some sense of the breadth of what else is on the shelf next to the book that you're trying to sell. Does that make sense? And that's necessary and horrible. I can never, you know, even when my publishers approach me for this, I'm like, I don't know, it's either go to the library. What do I know? So again, the baby steps and of choosing journals, how to approach a publisher as a translator, all of that applies for the writer choosing someone for their book, but also for the translator choosing someone for their translated book. And again, if you go to festivals and you have a book in hand, you say, I just read this book and it would be amazing, and you run into the publisher of, you know, a vehicle press, oh, I think this would be a really good fit for you. And they might then tell you, oh, actually, we're switching over. We're not doing so much nonfiction, we're doing fiction. So then you know, okay, I'm going to anticipate what they're doing next time and pitch them a book that's more appropriate. And again, make sure you've read their list, make sure you know what they're publishing, make sure that what you're suggesting makes sense with what they're wanting to publish. And we'll talk about also, I want to talk about contests here. So as a writer who wants to get their work translated, you won't necessarily have access to contests because it'll be the translator who will be submitting to contests. You can certainly propose them. But there are contests that are that don't stipulate that translation is not eligible. So for example, you know, I mentioned the Fiddlehead has an annual fiction contest, or biannual maybe fiction contest. Why not send a piece that's translated into that? As a translator, as a literary translator, you are part of the writing team. You are the collaborative writer, and so you can absolutely do that unless there's a specific interdiction against that. So consider journals and consider also contests, which are a good way to have, again, that calling card of the translated work that you can then send to Vehicle and say, look, this was published and it won a prize, and maybe you want to publish the whole book. So those are good steps towards eventually building up to a whole book. The question also, I want to come back around to professional development. I mentioned getting the skill set, but also it's always worth honing the skill set. And it's a good place to meet other translators, and a good place also sometimes to connect with publishers. So one of the 2 places, there's heaps of possible opportunities for this, you know, for like week-long workshops and that kind of thing all around the world. There's a couple that I want to mention. One of them is close by. It's Breadloaf in Vermont, which was virtual for a year, and I think they're going back and forth, or maybe they're all 100% back in person. And the American model is interesting because this is it's a week long, I think, or 10-day. The 2 weeks or a week, I forget. Someone flashed a number at me. It's 1 week. Thank you. And you get to meet, there's, you know, they have huge names there. They have really good keynotes. They have incredible people to work with on your fledgling manuscript. They also have, they have sort of speed dating with publishers. And so you'll be able to have kind of a 15-minute session with a publisher, and you can sit down and have your pitch and have your comp title and have your project description and have all your things, and be like, this is the book you want. So you get to have that face-to-face contact, which is an interesting kind of commercial feature of the skills development that they have at Breadloaf. And I will give you the I'll give you the link in the chat. The other one I want to mention is one that's at the University of North Anglia, BCLT, which I will also put in the chat in a second. And that's more focused on the output, but it's a really good place to make connections with people from all over the world, all over Europe. They have incredible writers there. The British Center for Literary Translation, and they also they've had incredible people there leading these workshops. They often have different language pairs too. They've had they mix it up, including sometimes you can go back and forth. And that's an amazing place to find out also the differences in international publishing, because although we have this great Canadian system, you're also allowed to publish elsewhere in the English-speaking world if you're translating into English. So those are good places to make some of those connections and to feed you a little bit, right? Translation and writing can get kind of lonely, which is why we like to hang out on Zoom with 70 people sometimes on a Wednesday afternoon. There's one more opportunity I want to mention, which is LTAC's Quebec City residency, which is at the, let's see if I can find it, at the La Maison d'Écriture in Quebec City. It's this gorgeous converted church. And the call for submissions comes out usually in November, December. The deadline is in December usually. And this is an opportunity to go to a residency with your author as a translator. So you get to, you apply for both. And I believe the rule is that one of them has to be a Quebec resident. And so you take your author there for a week, and you basically nerd out with their work for a week. You have you're housed in this gorgeous building adjacent to this library, or this converted church, which is like, this gorgeous staircase and everything like this. And you have a week to work with your author and just to really go through the manuscript with them, and to have that time that we really seldom have as translators. That's a really good opportunity. And again, if you're putting an application together with that, think of, pertinence and suitability and all that kind of stuff. But it's a really good place also to have more onus on the art than on the commercial side, which is a rarity. So I highly, highly recommend that. They've had really good people there. And then there's also, for community, there's also conferences. There's the Alta conference every year. There's the LTX AGM has been kind of more, I think, business-like recently, but there's lots of good conversations going on there. There's the Facebook group I mentioned, which I can also put in the chat if you want. It's just called Literary Translation, but it has heaps of people having really, really variety of conversations about specific word use or about publication opportunities, about everything in between. So it's a good place to lurk if you're interested, and a good place to find community if you're already a bit more established. So I'm gonna summarize this one for you. Here, let's go to share our screen again. Look at me being all technological. All right. Oops. Sorry. So this is the. You see my screen? No. What am I doing? Hold on. All right, let's try that again. Sorry, can you see this, or what am I doing here? Yes, you can see this, Riley? Can you nod? Yeah, okay. Yeah, sorry, the slideshow is dysfunctional, but you can see this, right? So this is a summary of the stuff we've talked about for writers. So if you want to have a bit of a recap and then ask your questions afterwards. So this is the writer one that we just talked about. And then for translators, again, the importance of skills development, of choosing a book. So you're choosing it for love or for money, and sometimes for both. How to write a pitch. I'm happy to expand upon that if you want. And I'm sure other people will be able to add even more information to that conversation. How to approach collaborators, including publishers, translators, etc. Different options for publication, support programs, and some of the professional development, residency, and community opportunities. We've had a bunch of links in the sidebar, and I'll let you ruminate on your questions for a few minutes. So we'll have at least like 35-40 minutes for questions. But just to close my verbose section of this conversation, I wanted to mention the importance of acknowledgement and advocacy for translators, for literary translators, both by writers. So we talked about the importance, for example, of having editing. There's also, unfortunately, the writing milieu in Canada and around the world right now is not the most lucrative. But I did want to point out that the Canada Council rates, the CAC rates, have actually been static for translations 2009. UNEC, the Union des écrivains québécois, actually is suggesting 7 cents higher for, I think, for most fields, certainly for fiction, than the CAC has been holding at for the past, 15 years, which is, inflation has gone up in the past 10 minutes, never mind since 2009. So I think that's, if you're at all involved in any of these, any organizations, that's an important point of advocacy, and you can ask for more money. So even though a publisher may approach you and say, we pay 18 cents a word because that's what the CAC gives us, you can say, well, UNEC, which I'm a member of, forces me to ask for 25 cents a word. And then you negotiate or whatever, right? But at least then you equip the publisher to go back to the Canada Council and say, we need more money. We can't be paying people these rates. I know this is a fraught, it's a fraught point, and it's hard because you want to work more than, maybe more than anything. You want to publish this book that you love. But that's definitely a point that we can ask for and that we should be asking for. Which is also leads me to the importance of associative life and associative participation. So if you do have a trajectory as a writer or as a poet or as a translator or as any other kind of writer, I think it's important and useful and beneficial, and also a responsibility to be a part of the QWF, to be a part of TWUC, to be a part of LTAC, to be a part of UNIC. I think we have a responsibility. You don't have to do everything on every committee for everything, but I think that there is a sense that we have to be involved, because this is what people have been fighting for the past 50, 60 years, since many of these organizations were founded. And so I think that it's really it's kind of a civic duty that artists have to be involved and to make sure that our voices keep being heard. Art is what makes us human, but what makes us human is also that we have food on the table to put into the human being. So those two things really go hand in hand. I want to absolutely encourage that participation. Many of these associations also offer really important tools for translators and for writers, such as like the LTAC contract template is super useful. It really gives you a good breakdown of what your contract should look like. Or TWUC that has contract revision services, like a lawyer will actually look through your contract and see if you're being if you're being taken for a ride or whatever. And finally, I want to mention the importance of acknowledging translators. I think that there has been a conversation recently, like Jenny Croft had this piece in The Guardian last year, and it's been talked about here and there about whether translators' names should be on the cover of a book as well as the authors, whether a review in a magazine or online should mention the translator. And I think we're segueing into we're segueing from this kind of translators' invisibility to a bit more transparency in that collaboration that Dana was talking about in that clip I showed. I see no reason not to. And if you're doing it in your own daily life, if you have any control over it, please acknowledge the translator, whether it's, that you're putting up a citation on Facebook on your page, or that you're writing a review for something. There are two voices there. There are multiple voices there. And I think it's important and interesting, more often than not, to acknowledge them both. So, sur ce, I will turn it over to questions. I do want to put up one last link. Actually, I'll put up while you're rustling around in your brain for questions. I'll put up the link to the UNIC rates, because many people haven't seen those, and they're a really good source of, well, a place to start negotiating essentially. So I will put this here for you as well. It also gives, not just if you just do a page search for traduction littéraire, it'll pop up, but it also gives you all the rates for any kind of presentation or workshops or teaching as well, if you do any of that in your professional life. So. I'm looking through though for questions. Are there any hands up, or does anyone have any questions I'll go through the chat quickly and start there. All right, so there's a Zoom user who's unnamed who posted the following question first, and then I'll get to Claire and to Chris, who writes, as an author, do you need to have a facility in the language of translation? I don't know who that person was, but I assume you mean in the target language. And in the source language, right? I'm not sure who, that was Eugene. Okay. Yes, absolutely. So, ideally you have access to both of them in such a seamless way that you know it so well that you hear it in one ear and it comes out your mouth, kind of thing. That's not always the case. And people have translated the cribs, and that often is fine, or translated with a second person who's more fluent in the source language. So there are a number of ways to bridge that gap if there is a gap. Ideally, obviously, you'd have both. But even if you do have both, you still need often mediation. To give you an example, if I translate out of Croatian, I speak the Croatian my father left when he left, in the 70s. And so I'm missing this whole generation of lingo of whatever. And so I will often need, Yael Gaban, who translated Rob Rice's first novel, we had this big conversation online at one point about current swear words in English for, how do you, or in French, what are the equivalencies? What are the regional equivalencies? If we're in Northern Ontario, what would that sound like in French? And so you may often need mediators either for region or for language or for meaning or for age group, right? So I had the word kiffe, but in 2020, in a book written in 2020, so kiffe then means something very different than it meant in Paris in the 70s. You often need kind of contextual readers as well. So I don't think it's impossible. It's ideal if you have it at your fingertips, but you often need other voices that inform how how your book is going to sound, basically. Does that answer your question, Gina? Okay. I'll get to the hands in a second. I want to go through the chat because I think they popped up first. So Claire asks, what are best ways to keep up with festivals, conferences, and other opportunities to meet publishers apart from LTAC? So, I mean, Blumet is a really big one here in Montreal that we're lucky to have, which is international. And so you have people from all over the world, and you have books that are being sold that are published all over the world. There are other similar festivals. I would say get on the mailing list of one, and you'll then be on the mailing list of other ones. You'll see them kind of pop up. QWF also has a really good newsletter that is really comprehensive in terms of opportunities. So if you're not a member of QWF, you should join them. It's almost heartbreakingly cheap, and you will have access to scads of information. Also, if you're choosing, for example, be judicious about what you're choosing, I would say. So if you're looking to translate a book by a German author, Google like festivals in Germany, and maybe you can focus on something that is more pertinent to the particular language or the topic that you're translating from. So be informed, but don't feel like you also need to have this, sample from everything. There's obviously no way to attend everything and be everywhere. Does that answer your question, Claire? Yeah. I'll take Chris's question, and I'll go back around the hands on the board. So Chris asks, is a project's length something to consider when pitching? Yes. Are longer works considered unattractive? No, not necessarily. And he says, I was once asked by a translator if I would consider having him pitch an abridged version to a publisher. Oh, that's interesting. I've not heard of that. And I would wonder what the publisher would think about that. That's really, I mean, I would see that more in terms of like an anthology, right? So for example, if you have a novel, about the climate crisis or whatever, and you have an anthology that's coming out that's about the climate crisis, nonfiction pieces or creative nonfiction, you can certainly do a chapter or a piece of that book in that anthology. So that would be a more obvious way to excerpt something than I think condensing. I don't know of a lot of publishers who would publish something abridged, or I wonder. That's not to say that it can't happen. You could even publish it over 2 years or do like installments, do multiple volumes.
If I can just say, I think it was because of the cost of paper, and I think French is so much longer than English. I think it takes up a lot more space, and so the goal would be to pitch something that would be financially more beneficial, I think. So
interesting. I mean, in that case, I would say go right to ebook. If the cost of paper is the thing, there's ways around that as well. But certainly flexibility and problem solving are always a good thing to have in the arts field in general. And so if you can say, well, what if we just did this? If this is too much, or what if this doesn't work, how can we make this happen? And if the book is really, is what you want to do, and the publisher is the one you want to do it with, there's often ways to find a way around that to make that happen. But length can be a problem. Although if you're getting the funding from the Canada Council, it's paid by the word anyway, so it's theoretically it shouldn't if they're going through that. So I don't know which hand was first. Do I have a list of hands? I think Catherine was first, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, go ahead, Catherine.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. I'm sorry, you'll have to cope with my broken English to start with. I'm from Montreal. I live in Montreal. I'm a published writer. And my question is it just me, or is it particularly difficult here in Quebec to get your books translated from French to English? Is there some sort of, I don't know, pushback or resistance? You know what I mean? And how can we, find a way to maneuver through all of those difficulties?
I'm not sure if one is harder than the other. So I'll answer in English if that's okay. So I think most people are English speakers here, but I think that it feels hard in both directions, to be honest. It feels like translations tend not to sell. I don't know if there's any publishers on the Zoom, but translations tend to sell less well, and often books are a hard sell anyway. But translations are so often on the bottom of the list that publishers are reluctant to take the risk. I feel like it's also, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm so sorry. I don't want to interrupt. I mean, if there's one place where it should, so many books should be translated, it's here, particularly Montreal. So what's a problem?
I think some publishers, when they are, and this is especially, I see this from French and English, because English is so much, just by dint of the number of speakers in the world, is so much of a lingua franca, so to speak. Mm-hmm. a lot of French translators seem to expect there to be a lot more readership and therefore money attached to their translated. So, for example, a publisher may expect Penguin to come drive up to their house with a truck of money, but may overlook a really small publisher that wouldn't have the same marketing resources, that wouldn't have the same, they wouldn't be able to make a video or what, they wouldn't have kind of the same weight to put behind that book. And they expect, because the English market is so much bigger, especially in Canada, than the French market, they expect that their book would be and should be able to reach that bigger readership and that, that much more money, basically. And so sometimes I feel like they actually overlook the smaller publishers and kind of shoot themselves in the foot by doing that, because those are often the people who are going to be doing it because it's a labor of love. They're going to really put their back into the book and really try to sell it. Whereas with larger publishers, it actually might get lost in the shuffle. I feel like also there's often, even on the English side, I see that some publishers will say, oh no, we can't take, we don't take any poetry. We only take books that are specifically about Quebec. We only take books that are specifically not about Quebec. Everybody has their own, for whatever reason, whether it's really their editorial mandate is really set, or they have this preconception about what they can or can't publish. It's really, and if they have 5 books they're publishing and one of them every 2 years is a translation, the percentage of that is infinitesimal. So I think it's a problem of volume, and it's a problem also of just finding the right fit. And then you have the other problem too of once, some publishers will really follow authors and do the author's book, the first, second book, the third book, and really follow them in their career. And other publishers will be looking for the next hot thing. So you really have so many competing interests. But it's funny that you say that about the French side, because I think a lot of us feel the same thing about the English side.
Yeah, interesting.
I have commiseration, but not a lot of solutions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think Sunny was next.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for doing this. This is great. I have a few questions, but I guess the first one is, I've been a translator for about 15 years. I'm self-taught. I've worked mostly in the community sector, academic work, and a lot within the queer community. And I started working a lot for free at first because it was militancy, it was organizing, and I built up a client base. And I'm just wondering, I really would like, I'm also a writer, and so I'd love to do more literary translation. But I'm wondering how to sort of get those first contracts. Do I need to work on some samples? Do I work for free a bit? So just wondering, where does it begin?
You're looking at having book translations published. Is that what you're kind of what you're aiming for?
Yeah, I'd like to translate a book, or I guess I could start with a smaller piece, but yeah.
I would say don't work for free. That's the first one, is don't, but free can have, not free can have many different forms. So I'm not a big fan of exposure, but that said, if you, for example, do a piece for an anthology and the anthology is not paid, but there's other pretty, there are other names that are of a piece with what you're trying to do in there, that can actually be really valuable. And then that's your sample, because your sample you're going to do for free anyway, but that's your calling card then. Right. So I'd go back to anthologies and to journals. Really, journals are the big overlooked piece, I think, in the translation ecosystem, literary translation ecosystem, because we tend to think of them as being, they publish 4 times a year and it's all just original stuff. But not many of them have restrictions against translations. And most of them, if you approach them and say, hey, there's this really great writer from Quebec who's doing all this really cool stuff, and you probably don't know them, and wouldn't your readers like to discover them? And here's a really, and so that'll be paid, whatever, it'll be paid $50 a page or something. It's not, that's not really what you're going to be making your living on. But then you have that piece that's published to approach an editor with it, or publisher with it. So I cannot stress enough the importance of doing those small pieces. And regardless, you'd be doing a sample for your pitch, be doing kind of a chapter of 1,200, 1,500 words or whatever anyway. And so you'd have to have that material anyway. So you may as well, try to publish it somewhere. Basically, you'll also sometimes get editorial feedback when you do that. So your publisher might, or the journal might get back to you and say, oh, actually, have you considered, whatever, this turn of phrase here? And so you had that valuable conversation. You also maybe have a person who'll be able to say to you, oh, if you ask them, I really want to publish this book, maybe they have someone to recommend. So each of those steps, you're not working for free, you're working to invest in something larger, basically. But the actual book, I wouldn't say, never translate a book for free unless you're looking at self-publication, basically.
Great, thanks.
That helps? Does that answer your question?
Yep, totally.
And then I think we had another one in the chat that kind of got tucked in there. Contemporary examples of writers who translated their own books. Yeah, I mean, so Crystal puts in Tuia Tanya's book that Livre les Ailes was translated. There's a number of books that are translated by their, I mean, think of someone like, what's her name? Svetlana Todorov's wife, who's I'm blanking on, who translated her own books. So actually the translation into English was better than the original, than her French, which is her mother tongue. But and Catherine asks, I need thoughts on translating Indigenous authors who write in French. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just edited a book, Natasha Canapé-Fontaine's Silence pour un bruit, which is coming out with Book Hug, translated by Howard Scott. There's heaps of stuff coming out. There's so many good books, and many publishers are increasingly willing to and looking to have to indigenize their editorial list, their book list. So that's a great, I think a great, yes.
But have you had any pushback about the fact that you're non-Indigenous? I've translated 2 collections of short stories by Indigenous authors, and was working on a 3rd and got a screed sent to me about how I'm white.
Yeah. And I mean, and fair enough. I feel like Indigenous writers, authors, and publishers are not wrong to be super pissed after the 400 years of garbage they've had to endure. And I'm not saying that is in any way attached to your work. In this case, I was actually editing the book, but Howard's not Indigenous either, the translator of the book. And ultimately, that choice lies with the author and with the publisher. So one publisher, as you're suggesting, might have a much different stance than another one. Where possible, I think in an ideal world, we would have the world of literary translation would be so representative and so diverse of not just different people working, but different viewpoints and different approaches and different, just different ways to look at language and come into language and transfer language into another one. That the whole field would be just, there'd be like this wonderful permeability, which is not yet the case. I think literary translation is largely, the vectors are like our education, our privilege, our whiteness. And so as much as we can try to change that for the good, there are publishers who are trying to change that in much more categorical ways, and people who have perhaps more fluid approaches, like Stefan, who said to me, well, I'm Black enough for the 2 of us. So you'll find both. I do think absolutely that if you're translating work outside of your kind of identity or comfort zone, or then you have the responsibility to have sensitivity readers. You have the responsibility to make sure that you're in league with the author, and that you really have a sense of faithfulness, not just to the language, because the language is already layered and layered and layered with all kinds of colonial stuff, but also to what's actually happening underneath that. So I think that I'm sorry that was your experience. I don't think it invalidates the possibility that a white translator could translate an Indigenous author at all. But that's obviously the choice lies with the author and with the publisher. And ideally,
I thought there are a lot of Indigenous translators rushing to translate.
Well, but there's also like
French
the problem.
Indigenous words. So.
But the problem is also that there has like the gatekeeping in literary translation, as in any other field of publishing and arts and education and cultural work, have been really tremendous for the past many centuries, decades. And so I think as we try to kind of undermine those barriers, there's going to be adjustment. There's going to be adjustment periods, and hopefully the outcome was going to be that there are going to be as many translators as there are, as there are authors who identify in whatever ways. But we're not there yet, unfortunately. I'm sorry, I don't think that's much help, but I think that there are publishers who are open to.
Well, the publisher was happy to publish, and there were I think a total of maybe 20-some authors of short stories, all Indigenous, and this is just one person who had a freak out.
They're allowed.
So.
They're allowed.
Well,
thank you for your question. I think it's a super important conversation that I'm glad we're having, even though it's a hard one for sure. Thank you, Catherine. I think that there was a question from Sarah also. Did I skip over anyone? Sarah, do you still have your hand up? Where did Sarah go? I'm not sure which Sarah it was because no last name. Okay, re-raise your hand, Sarah, if I've stepped over you here. Here we have raised hands. Who's got their hand raised? Am I missing people?
Christopher has his hand.
There you go. Yeah, Christopher, go ahead.
Hi there. Sorry. Just to sort of make a quick comment about something that Catherine said earlier. I'm also in Montreal, and I asked my publisher, could we translate the book from English into French? And they looked at me like I'd sprouted a second head. So I don't think it's a language thing. I think it very much is a capitalism thing. That being said, my question is sort of related. I mean, we're in Montreal, we're in Canada. We have a lot of different ethnic groups there. Is there any mechanism or any willingness on the part of local publishers to do at least Canadian translations in different languages? By which I mean, you're taking a book, you're just translating it in a bunch of different languages and selling it within Canada without having to necessarily sell the translation rights to a publisher in Germany or Greece or what have you. Is that a thing, or have I in fact sprouted a second head?
No, wouldn't a second head be handy though for, especially as a translator? Certainly it's a thing. The problem in Canada is that there's no money for it from the Canada Council, which is the, like, by and large the mainstream way to get funding. And so publishers are obviously hesitant to undertake things that they can't pay. Though certainly, you know, Guernica does published translations. I feel like Exile Editions, if they still exist, published translations from not from colonial to colonial languages or indigenous languages. Brick Poetry Press has done some out of not French or English. Not French in their case. It's certainly less common. And again, you know, read the list and see what's out there. It's you know, I would say percentage wise, it's under 1% for sure, just because of the funding system, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, you know, I'm not sure the Catholic Council right now has the bandwidth to even be able to consider the possibility of expanding that.
Right.
Unfortunately.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up question? If you do get a foreign publisher to translate and publish your book in Greece, Germany, Italy, what have you, does it then become very logistically complicated for them to sell in Canada or republish, at least in Canada? Because I'm just thinking shipping costs would be prohibitively expensive for a lot of people.
I feel like most international publishers will have distributors in the States. And so that will be, and or a partner publisher in some cases. And so I don't think that would be a huge problem. They're also often happy to find out about, for example, Canadian prizes. So you publish a book, you know, in Italy or whatever, but by, let's say, a French author into English or whatever. And you can it can be submitted to a prize here because you're a Canadian translator, or Canadian author, you know, one or the other. And so then that creates a new link for that publisher and a new way into this market. So most often, you know, if they have any sense, they should be happy to have that market open and to have that avenue explored. But obviously it requires work on every part, and it does require a bit more work, not just because of shipping costs, but just because of it's a new way to, you know, it's a new structure. They don't know necessarily the infrastructure here. So the possibilities are there, and the logistics complicate things, but they're not impossible. Certainly not now. No, with the virtual technology that we have. I had one more hand raised, and there was a couple more questions in the chat that I want to go back to. Joe asked, don't hate me for asking this, I won't hate you. This blasphemous question. How verboten is it to investigate using large language models such as ChatGPT to assist in translation? I mean, it's not verboten at all. Knock yourself out. The problem with AI, and this is a whole separate lunch and learn, or a whole separate, I don't even know what. The problem with AI is that it doesn't know how to think. And thinking is not, in translation, equivalency is not really what it's about. I mean, yes, you know, for example, you can use either ChatGPT or whatever, DeepL or something, to find a word where previously you would have had 6 paper dictionaries on your shelf and had to, like, call up somebody in the forestry department at the university or whatever, find that word. And now we have access to that immediately, which is fantastic. That said, especially with literary translation, there is no way to digest, like spiritually digest a sentence or a poem or a phrase or all the other kind of subterranean stuff in a text and reproduce it in a way that has artistic credibility and just use machine translation, I think, at this point. And I'm whatever, I'm old enough that I may never see that day, but I'm not sure that there is, and it's I don't know that it's blasphemous, it's a tool, but you know, let's not become the tools of our tools, basically. I hope that I'm not absolving you, but that's that would be my answer to that question. I'll take Cora's question and then Danielle and Margaret, and then we'll see where we are at. Cora asks, probably a naive question, but what are your thoughts around authors translating their own books? So this was kind of posed before. Nancy Houston is the name I was looking for. Thank you for filling in that gap. It's funny. So maybe I'll answer this by way of anecdote. So French was my first language, and I was at the Festival de Poésie Trois-Rivières a bunch of years ago as a poet, not as a translator. And because I had been corresponding entirely in French with the people who were like doing the booking and everything, no one had thought to tell me that authors who read in non-French languages are expected to have their works translated when they get there. And so I got to the first event, and the other authors were, I think, you know, a couple of authors writing in Spanish or whatever it was, and they started reading their work in French and acknowledged the translators. I thought, shit, I did not do that. I only had my work in English. And that's all, obviously if you're reading in Trois-Rivières in English, it's exponentially worse to be doing so in English than in Greek or Spanish or whatever else. And so I went back to the hotel that night and frantically translated my own poems into French, which was fine. And so the rest of the weekend was fine, and I read them in French and la la la. And then there was kind of a secondary event here at I think at the Grande Bibliothèque or something, and I had Danielle Canty translate my poems, the same poems, because there is part of the same, like, continue of the same event. And it was so interesting how the addition of a second author, really, in that conversation opened up the poems in ways that I could not have because I was living too far inside them. And so, I mean, I guess that would be my thought. I don't know why you would want to rewrite your own book. You've already written it once, and it was probably like you probably lost your mind writing your own book, right? You had 40 mental breakdowns writing your own book. Why would you want to go through that again in the other language, basically? And as far as Nancy Houston is concerned specifically, I think her originals in English are actually stronger than her translations into French. Or sorry, vice versa. I think her originals in French are stronger than her translations into English, even though she's Anglophone by birth or by whatever. Anyway, I don't know if that answered the question kind of circuitously, but thank you for raising that.
Thank you, Katia.
Thanks, Cora. And then Donald, we also missed your question, sorry, before I get to Danielle and Margaret. So Donald asks, my book was a hybrid publication through Friesen Press. It is now sold in Indigo local stores. Lo and behold, much to my surprise, it's won 6 national and international awards. Congratulations. What publishing company could I approach to ask if they'd be interested in translating my book? Prizes notwithstanding, that'll make it way easier to sell, but the fit still has to be the primary consideration. I think you want to find a publisher who's, I mean, it's like dating, right? You want to find someone who speaks the language, who's going to be able to give the book what it needs. And if it doesn't, you could have won all the prize in the world and it still wouldn't come out right. Basically, would not be a good fit. So I don't know if that kind of answers that question. It will make it, the fact that it's gotten attention is amazing. Obviously, it makes it much easier for your publisher and for yourself to approach people and say, this did really well, but it'll be a good fit, not because of the prizes. It'll catch their eye because of the prizes. It'll be a good fit because it's a good fit.
I see. Okay, thank you.
And then Margaret, you had your hand raised and you had a question in the chat, so I don't know if you want to ask it or was it the same question?
I just had a quick question. You were mentioning an organization. It sounded like TUAC, and I didn't understand which one was that.
The Writers Union of Canada. Do I have it somewhere here? Sorry. I will try to find it and put it in the chat. Yeah, the Writers Union of Canada is I don't have it open. Sorry, I'll try to find it. Is the kind of advocacy professional group for all writers of any genre in Canada. Their membership, I think, is about $200 a year now, and they have they do such excellent work, such excellent advocacy work, such excellent work on copyright. I would absolutely, if you're going to join any organization as a kind of writer of any genre, they're the one I would recommend for sure. And I just put a link in the chat there for you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great question.
That would be useful.
Yes, thank you, Howard, actually. So I'm going to do a little a parenthèse here. Howard Scott does mention that there is Canada Council money for translators from other languages. I think that's through the Arts Abroad program, right, Howard, if I'm not mistaken? Is Howard still here? So that that is the Arts Abroad program, but I think you need to have a partner publisher.
No, it's for,
or that's through the mainstream one. Go ahead.
it's for any language, from any language into French or English or Indigenous languages. But it has to be published in Canada.
Yeah.
Canadian writers published in Canada. So, like, for instance, Bodil Jensen translated her mother's book, which was published in Danish in Canada. And that got Canada Council money.
That's excellent to know, and thank you for adding that. Do you know who it was published by, out of curiosity? I guess I could look that up.
No, it was years ago. I mean,
yeah. Although Catherine then adds that Exile still exists, but he's getting out of publishing. So there are publishers to answer. I forget whose question this was about publishing out of other languages. There is occasionally money for it, and occasionally publishers to do the work. Where were we here? I think Daniela had a question also, but your hand. Yeah, Daniela, go ahead. Hi. I think you're muted still. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry. My question was about BabbleCube. I don't know how many people are familiar with it. When I first started out, I teamed up with young translators, young or less young translators who were just students for translation or whatever, and had 3 or 4 books published that way. by, I think it's the Amazon platform that owns BabbleCube now. So it's a platform where you can have your book translated from any language to any language, and you agree to share 50-50 the royalties with the translator. How do you feel about that? Is that
I don't feel great about Amazon in general. And so I'd be hesitant to give them any intellectual property or any money. Certainly it's useful. I mean, the Amazon platforms have been useful for publishing books that otherwise might be harder to find an audience for, or for people who want to get their book to market quickly. So certainly it's useful for that. I'm also not sure about how even the quality of the translations are in that case. And so I'd be really curious to find out more about how what the inputs are into the translation side of things.
It's free. I mean, the thing is, the author doesn't pay, the translator doesn't pay, they just share the royalties, and then obviously you need to pay somebody to check the translation. But okay, so you don't like it because it's Amazon, but otherwise you don't.
Well, but I mean, like we could be here all day as well. But part of the reason, like you just said, nobody gets paid; they share the royalties, and you have to get someone to check the translation. But that's also kind of secondary and not obligatory. And so the whole, I mean, the point of creating a book, to my mind, is that you want to have it be a conversation that is transparent and pertinent and vivid and life-changing in some way. And I think that the reason we've evolved the literary ecosystem that we have, which has things like editors and things like proofreaders and things like graphic designers and et cetera, is that we can make sure that those pieces are communicating in the most efficient way. And if money is the bottom line that underlies all those considerations, then those considerations will be secondary. And it's fine for people who want that to be the primary consideration, but that hasn't been mine, which is the reason for my hesitancy about that kind of platform, if that makes sense. I'm not saying it's not useful for some people, or it's not valid, but that would be my hesitancy would be about the quality of what can be created when quality is not the primary consideration, if that makes sense. Does that answer the question? Sorry to be.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to have your take on it. Yeah.
Thanks for the question, though. It's certainly, and it's good, I think, for people to know that exists for sure. I think Pablo, you had a question also.
Hi, thanks, Katia. This is a great discussion. I kind of just want to make a comment, and maybe it's not strictly a question, and maybe other people can add to it. I just wanted to bring the publisher's perspective into this. My own experience, I'm not a publisher, but I've worked with several, and we need to not think of them like in movies where they're sitting on big beds of money and eating massive lunches, and just publishers are kind of heroically publishing book after book that no one buys. And we need to do everything we can to help them. And I think the other thing that I've really learned is it's really a long-term relationship. So you're not helping anyone by pitching them something that they're not going to like once it's done, or isn't going to do well. So you really need to, I find, when you're pitching, be very careful and really try to find a book that you love, but also that you think English readers will love. Because if you pitch them something, often they won't be able to read it until they see your finished translation, and then they're like, oh, well, actually I don't like it. They're not going to work with you again. So I just want to mention it's incredibly hard for publishers right now. The work they're doing the hours are long. Editing a translation is really long, trying to market it. So we really need to look at ourselves as part of a large chain, which, as Katia mentioned, includes editors, includes the person designing the cover, and we're all working together to try and get something into the world that hopefully more than one or two readers will pick up and buy in the end. So really, I would just suggest that in all our interactions with publishers and with authors and everyone else in the ecosystem, just really think of these as long-term relationships with people who are working very hard in a thankless job often.
Totally. Thank you for that that testament. And I think it's an important thing to mention that the collaboration is a collaboration. It's not antagonistic. The publisher is not a means to an end. They're part of the dialogue towards the readership for sure. So I think that's maybe a good a good place to close the conversation. That was a kind of combines the necessary and heartfelt side of publishing translations and the and also the pragmatic side. So I hope that that's answered as many questions as you have. I do want to invite you, if any questions pop afterwards, I'm happy to keep answering them, so you can communicate with either John or Riley at the QWF, and they'll put you in touch with me. They can forward me your email if you have any questions that come up. I'd be happy to entertain them. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Katia, and thank you to everyone for attending. Hope you learned a lot during this Lunch and Learn. Katia, that was incredibly informative. I'm sure I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people here definitely did. So we really thank you for taking time out of your busy day translating and reading books to come talk to us. Again, just to close, I'll just quickly mention that the QWF does have a translation prize as well. QWF's Cole Foundation Prize for Translation, which Katia won last year, will be opening this month. And the competition this year is for books that have been translated from English to French. So any books over the past 2 years, if they've been translated from English to French, tell your publishers to submit them just so they could be considered for this year's award. Usually the translation prize is the one where we get the most number of entries. So I do think the translation is definitely alive and well, especially here in Quebec. And yeah, so thank you all for coming, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you once again, Katia. Bye all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.